Welcome to Bedtime Historia. Tonight, we won't chase excitement or drama. We won't follow kings or battles, nor will we seek out the loud moments of history. Instead, we'll step softly into something quieter, something slower, a story that unfolds like the turning of pages in an old book, read by candlelight. This is a journey through time, not to the grand halls of empires, but to the corners of life often overlooked, to the hands that planted seeds, to the voices that sang lullabies, to the eyes that saw the world a little differently. And tonight, we walk gently alongside those who were once seen as different, people whose lives touched history in ways both small and deep. People with Down syndrome. Their joys, their struggles, their quiet places in time. Before you sink into relaxation and allow your thoughts to soften, if it feels right, we'd love for you to take a quiet moment to like this video and follow our channel. And if you'd like, we'd be delighted to read your message. Tell us where you're listening from and what hour of the night it is for you now. Knowing that people from across the globe are here with us in this shared hush brings us so much joy. Thank you truly for making space for us in your evening. So lower the lights, find your most comfortable spot, and let everything else settle. If this is your time to sleep, then close your eyes and just listen. Release the day with kindness. We're here to walk beside you, gently moving through time and story, leading you toward peace, toward softness, and into a deep, tranquil sleep. Part 1: Ancient Civilizations. The sun rose slowly over the land of Kemet, as the Egyptians called it, the Black Land, named not for the color of its people, but for the rich dark soil left behind each year when the great Nile River spilled over its banks. It was a land where life began again and again with every flood, every planting, every harvest. The sky stretched wide and endless above the flat horizon, painted in soft hues of gold and blue. In the early morning light, the river shimmered like polished copper, winding its way through the dry desert like a silver thread sewn into the earth. Along its banks, small villages stood quietly among fields of barley and emmer wheat. Reeds grew tall beside the water and children played barefoot in the dust, their laughter rising with the morning breeze. Smoke curled from clay chimneys, and the scent of fresh bread baking in the ovens drifted through the air. Dogs barked in the distance, donkeys brayed, and somewhere near the edge of the village, a woman gave birth beneath the shade of a sycamore tree. She was young, her face lined with sweat and effort, her hands gripping the arms of the midwife who knelt beside her. Around them gathered women of the village, whispering prayers to Hathor, goddess of motherhood and joy. The baby came at last with a cry that startled the birds from the trees and made the dogs pause in their play. A boy. Small, but strong. His skin warm and wet, his eyes already open, looking up at the faces around him with an expression so calm, so steady, that one of the older women paused mid-prayer and whispered, "He sees more than we do." In this time, in this place, difference was not always seen as something strange or wrong. Many believed that those born different had been touched by the gods, chosen perhaps for a special role in the great balance of Ma'at, the sacred order of life. Others believed such children were omens, signs from the divine world that could bring either fortune or misfortune depending on how they were treated. But here in this quiet village, there was no fear, only wonder. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, which meant Lord of Joy. His parents were farmers, simple people who lived by the rhythm of the seasons. His father worked the fields while his mother wove linen cloth and cooked meals over the fire. From the moment he could walk, Kai followed his mother everywhere, mimicking her movements, touching the dough as she kneaded it, watching the way she braided reeds into baskets. He learned slowly, but he learned with patience and care. And though his speech came later than other children's, when he did speak, his voice was soft and full of warmth. The villagers did not treat him as broken or lesser. Some saw him as blessed, others simply as another soul placed among them by the gods. When the priest visited during the festival of Osiris, he looked at Kai for a long moment before placing a hand on his head and saying, "This one carries peace within him. Do not fear what is gentle." Kai grew, and with him grew the routines of the village. Each morning, the rooster crowed before sunrise, and the day began with the smell of roasted barley and the sound of grinding stones. Children ran to the river to wash while their mothers prepared breakfast, flatbread, onions, dates, and goat's milk. Farmers set out to the fields with wooden plows and oxen, following the same paths their ancestors had walked for generations. Kai often went with his father, trailing behind as the man worked the land. He would sit beneath a fig tree and watch the workers bend and rise, like waves in the river. Sometimes he helped, picking weeds or handing tools to the men. Other times he just sat and listened, to the wind, to the songs of the workers, to the silence between sounds. There were moments when he struggled to understand things that seemed easy to others. Tying sandals, remembering names, counting beyond 5, he needed help with these things. But he never seemed frustrated. Instead, he smiled often, laughed easily, and reached out to touch the cheeks of crying babies until they stopped their tears. At night, the family gathered under the stars. Kai sat close to his mother, his head resting on her shoulder as she told stories of Ra's journey through the underworld, of Anubis weighing hearts in the afterlife, of the great battle between Horus and Set. He loved the stories, especially the ones about Thoth, the god of wisdom, who wrote everything down so nothing would be forgotten. One evening, as the moon hung low and full over the Nile, Kai pointed at it and said, "It watches us sleep." His mother smiled and pulled him closer. "Yes," she whispered. "And it dreams with us too." Time passed, as it always does. Seasons changed, festivals came and went, and Kai became a part of the village's rhythm, like the river, like the sun, like the wind that carried the seeds of tomorrow's crops across the fields. He was never asked to fight or build or lead, but he was always welcomed at the table, always included in the dance, always given a place beside the fire. There were no hospitals or schools like we know today, no written records of his condition, no scientific explanations for why he saw the world differently. There was only the slow unfolding of life, the quiet kindness of neighbors, and the belief that even those who walked a little slower had something valuable to offer. As the years passed, Kai continued to grow, not taller, not stronger, but deeper in spirit. He knew the names of all the animals, could recognize each bird by its call, and remembered the birthdays of every child in the village. When someone was sad, he would sit beside them without speaking, just breathing in the same rhythm as their sorrow until it softened. One afternoon, a traveling storyteller came to the village square. He spoke of distant lands, of pyramids being built in the north, of pharaohs who ruled with both power and mystery. At the end of his tale, he turned to Kai and asked, "And what story do you carry?" Kai looked at him for a long time before smiling and saying, "I carry the story of the river." The crowd laughed gently, but the storyteller bowed his head and said, "Then you carry the oldest story of all." That night, as Kai lay beneath the stars, his mother tucked the blanket around him and whispered, "You are safe. You are loved. And your story will never be forgotten." And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this very story might feel a little warmer, a little calmer, and maybe, just maybe, drift off to sleep. As the seasons passed in Kai's village, life continued in its quiet rhythm. The Nile flooded again, bringing fresh soil to the fields. The fig trees bore fruit, children grew taller, and elders leaned more heavily on their walking sticks. Kai remained as he had always been, gentle, present, a familiar presence under the shade of the sycamore tree where he often sat, watching the world move slowly around him. One year, a group of traders arrived from the north. They came down the river in wooden boats filled with jars of oil, baskets of dried figs, and bolts of fine linen. Among them was an older man who wore a beard dyed red with henna and spoke in a language few in the village understood. He noticed Kai sitting beneath the tree and paused, studying him for a long moment before speaking softly to one of the villagers. They exchanged a few words, and then the man turned back to Kai, crouched beside him, and said something kind. Though Kai did not understand the words, he smiled and reached out to touch the man's hand. A gesture of welcome. A gesture that needed no translation. Later, the villagers told Kai's mother what the trader had said. He comes from a land far beyond the sea, she was told, where people speak differently, think differently, and sometimes treat those like Kai differently. That thought lingered with her as she sat by the fire that night, watching her son sleep peacefully beside his younger sister. She wondered what it meant that somewhere, people might not see him as a gift, but as something strange. She could not imagine such a place, but she knew the world was wide, and not all winds blew gently. And so, we follow the path of those winds, leaving behind the warm sands of Egypt and crossing the waters of the Great Green Sea, the Mediterranean, to lands where marble statues stood tall beneath open skies, where philosophers gathered in shaded courtyards to ask questions about the nature of the soul, and where gods lived not only in temples, but in the minds of men. In ancient Greece, a boy named Leon was born into a family of farmers near the city of Corinth. His parents loved him deeply, though they often whispered among themselves about how he learned more slowly than other children, how his eyes looked at the world with a softness that made some smile and others frown. Greece was a land of many ideas, and not all of them were kind. Some believed that strength was everything, that the body must be perfect, and that weakness had no place in society. In Sparta, babies were examined at birth, and those deemed unfit were left to die upon the mountainside. But in other parts of Greece, especially in smaller villages like Leon's, there was still room for compassion. His father taught him to care for the olive trees, showing him how to press the ripe fruit into oil and store it in clay jars sealed with beeswax. His mother sang to him each evening, her voice rising above the crackling fire as the sun dipped behind the hills. He played with the other children, though sometimes they grew impatient when he could not keep up. Still, he laughed easily, and his laughter was contagious. One day, during a festival honoring Athena, Leon wandered away from the crowd and found himself standing alone before a statue of the goddess. He reached out and touched the cool stone, then looked up into her carved eyes and whispered something only he could hear. A priest nearby saw this and smiled. "He speaks with the gods," he told the boy's parents. "Perhaps he hears them better than most." Not everyone agreed. Some in the village muttered that he should be sent to the city to study under a physician, to see if there was a cure for his slowness. Others said he should be kept close, protected, allowed to live quietly among those who knew him best. Leon never heard these debates. He only knew the feel of the wind through the olive branches, the taste of honey on warm bread, the joy of chasing goats through the fields with the other children. He never questioned why he was different. He simply was. And yet, even in this beautiful land of learning and art, there were places where difference was feared. In Athens, the great city of thinkers and poets, a philosopher once wrote that the state should not allow deformed children to live. Another argued that those who could not reason clearly had no place in the ideal republic. But not all Greeks agreed. There were healers who studied the body with curiosity rather than judgment, who believed that every person had a role to play in the great harmony of life. And there were families who chose love over fear, who held their children close and whispered, "You are mine. You are enough." Time passed, and the Greek world changed. City-states rose and fell, wars were fought, and eventually, another empire began to stretch its power across the known world. From a small city on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome rose like the morning sun, casting its shadow over lands far and wide. It was here, in the heart of the Roman Empire, that a girl named Livia was born. Her family lived in a modest home near the edge of the city, where the smell of baking bread mixed with the scent of damp earth after rain. She was loved from the moment she took her first breath, though her mother noticed early on that she moved differently, spoke differently, seemed to carry a quiet peace within her that no one could explain. Rome was a place of laws and order, of discipline and duty. It was also a place of contradiction, where slaves could rise to become senators, where beauty and brutality walked side by side, where kindness sometimes hid behind cold marble walls. Livia's father was a scribe who worked in the forum, recording contracts and wills in neat lines of Latin. Her mother ran a small shop that sold wool and spices. Together, they raised Livia with patience, teaching her to count using small stones, to recognize letters carved in wax tablets, to help stir the dye vats when they prepared cloth for sale. She was never asked to join the legions or compete in the arena. But she was welcomed at festivals, invited to sit beside the hearth during winter feasts, and given small tasks that brought joy to others, like handing out fig cakes to children or placing garlands of flowers on the statues of household gods. There were moments when strangers stared too long, when curious glances followed her through the crowded streets. But her family shielded her as best they could, and in return, she gave them smiles that softened even the hardest days. Once, during a celebration of Saturnalia, when the world turned upside down and slaves dined with masters, Livia was chosen to carry a torch in the procession. She walked proudly through the streets, her flame flickering in the dusk, her face lit with wonder. No one laughed. No one looked away. For a brief moment, she was just another citizen of Rome, stepping forward beneath the stars. The Roman world was vast and ever-changing. Emperors rose and fell, new gods were worshipped, and the empire stretched further than any before it. Yet within its borders, lives like Livia's continued quietly, unnoticed by historians but deeply felt by those who loved her. And so, as our journey through ancient times begins to fade into memory, we leave behind the temples of Egypt, the olive groves of Greece, and the bustling streets of Rome. We carry with us the stories of Kai, Leon, and Livia, three souls who lived in different lands, under different skies, yet shared a quiet truth. They were seen. They were loved. And they were part of history, even if their names were never carved in stone. Now, as the world moves forward, time turns its pages once more, and we prepare to step into a new chapter, a time when faith would shape the hearts of many, and the quiet ones would find shelter in the folds of devotion. But for now, let your thoughts drift like sand in the wind. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind rest in the gentle warmth of these ancient days. Because our story is not over yet. Part 2, The Age of Faith. The wind blew gently through the valley that morning, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and wild thyme. Above the hills, the sky was pale blue, stretched wide like a fresco painted by unseen hands. In the distance, the bells of St. Remy Monastery rang out across the fields, calling the brothers from their sleep and their prayers to begin the day. The monastery stood quietly among orchards and vineyards, its stone walls worn smooth by time and rain. Smoke curled from the kitchen chimney as the first loaves of bread were pulled from the oven, warm and golden. Chickens clucked near the herb garden, and a few sheep grazed beyond the wooden fence, their wool still dusty from the night's rest. Inside the cloister, a young monk named Brother Thomas walked slowly beneath the arched colonnade, his sandals whispering against the cool stone floor. He carried a small bowl of porridge in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. His destination was the dormitory, where beside the rows of narrow beds lay a boy whose name had been given by the brothers, Matthew. Matthew had come to the monastery nearly 5 years ago, wrapped in a tattered blanket and placed gently on the steps before dawn. There had been no note, no explanation, only the soft cry of an infant reaching into the cold morning air. One of the older brothers had found him there, shivering but alive, and without hesitation, he was brought inside. Since then, Matthew had grown into a quiet presence among the monks. He did not speak much, though when he did, his voice was gentle, often repeating phrases he had heard during the daily prayers. He loved music, especially the long, low tones of the Gregorian chants that echoed through the chapel at dusk. When the brothers sang, Matthew would close his eyes and sway slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. His days followed a rhythm all his own. At sunrise, he helped feed the chickens, scattering grain with careful hands while the birds pecked eagerly around his feet. By mid-morning, he sat with Brother Thomas in the scriptorium, watching as the monk carefully copied passages from the Bible onto parchment. Matthew did not write himself, but he loved to hold the quill, to dip it into the ink, and to make soft marks on spare pieces of vellum. Sometimes, he would trace the letters already written, running his fingers over the dark lines as if trying to feel the meaning hidden within them. Once, after watching Brother Thomas for many weeks, Matthew reached out and touched the monk's hand, then pointed to the word peace. Brother Thomas smiled and said softly, "Yes, Matthew. That is peace." At noon, the brothers gathered for a simple meal, bread, cheese, and sometimes a bit of fish if it had been caught that morning. Matthew sat near the end of the table, always with a place saved for him. Though he ate slowly, no one rushed him. No one scolded him for dropping crumbs or for humming softly to himself between bites. After lunch, he would walk among the gardens, helping where he could. He loved the rosemary bushes and would often stop to crush a leaf between his fingers, breathing in the sharp, clean scent. Sometimes, he picked flowers and tucked them behind the ears of the younger monks, making them smile even when they tried to hide it. In the late afternoon, the brothers returned to the chapel for prayer. Matthew sat quietly near the back, his head bowed, his hands folded. He did not know all the Latin words, nor did he understand every phrase, but he felt the weight of the silence between the verses, the way the voices rose together like smoke curling toward heaven. When the service ended, he would follow the brothers outside, where the sun was beginning to dip behind the hills. He liked to sit on the stone bench beneath the old pear tree, watching the light fade across the fields. Sometimes, Brother Thomas joined him, bringing 2 small cups of warm milk. They never spoke much. They simply sat, side by side, as the stars began to appear in the sky. One evening, as the last of the daylight slipped away, Matthew looked up at the monk and said, "God is here." Brother Thomas turned to him, surprised. It was one of the longest sentences Matthew had ever spoken. He smiled gently and replied, "Yes, my friend. God is here." There was a time when children like Matthew might have been left alone in the woods, or sent away to live in distant villages where no one knew their names. But in this monastery, in this quiet corner of medieval Europe, he had found a home, not because he was needed, but simply because he was loved. The brothers did not ask him to fight, nor did they expect him to read great books or memorize long prayers. They asked only that he be present, that he breathe with them, eat with them, pray with them in whatever way he could. And in return, he gave them something they had not expected, a gentleness that softened the edges of their hard lives, a reminder that not everything had to be earned, that some gifts were simply given. Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the candles flickered in their sconces, Matthew would wake from a dream and find Brother Thomas sitting nearby, reading by lamplight. Without a word, the monk would open his arms, and Matthew would climb onto his lap, resting his head against the monk's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat until sleep came again. Time passed quietly in the monastery. Seasons changed, snow fell upon the roof tiles, and spring returned with new blossoms in the garden. Matthew grew taller, though he remained smaller than most boys his age. His hair turned darker, his eyes stayed kind. And somewhere far away, in another life, another time, someone listening to this story might feel a little warmer, a little calmer, and maybe, just maybe, drift off to sleep beneath the same stars that once watched over Matthew as he dreamed beneath the pear tree. As Matthew grew older, the world beyond the monastery walls remained much as it had for centuries. The land was still ruled by lords who lived in stone castles atop rolling hills, and the peasants who worked their fields rose each morning before dawn to begin another day of quiet labor. In the village not far from St. Remy, life unfolded slowly, shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the voice of the church bell. The villagers were simple folk, farmers, shepherds, bakers, weavers, whose days began with prayer and ended with firelight. They did not read books or write letters, but they knew the stories of saints and miracles by heart. They whispered them over meals, told them to their children beneath thick wool blankets, and passed them on like heirlooms from one generation to the next. It was said that every soul had a place in God's plan, even those who could not speak clearly or learn quickly. Some believed that such people were touched by heaven itself, chosen to live among mortals not because they were broken, but because they carried a piece of divine innocence within them. Others, however, were less certain. There were always those who feared what they did not understand, who saw difference as something unnatural, something best kept out of sight. Still, most families who welcomed such children into their homes did so without question. They gave them names, taught them small tasks, let them sit at the table during supper. A boy might help gather eggs from the henhouse, a girl might carry water from the well, and if their hands moved slower than others, no one scolded them for it. In one such home, there lived a young girl named Isabel. She was the daughter of a carpenter and his wife, who ran a small bakery where the scent of fresh bread filled the air from morning until night. Isabel had been born with eyes that looked gently upon the world, a smile that came easily, and a way of listening that made even the busiest adults pause when she turned her gaze toward them. She helped her mother in the kitchen, though not in the usual ways. She could not knead dough like her older sister, nor measure flour like her father, but she could sit quietly beside the oven and turn the spit roast slowly, watching the meat brown under the heat. She could fold napkins, stack bowls, and hum softly while sweeping the floor with a broom too big for her hands. At night, she sat with her family around the hearth, listening to the stories of Saint Genevieve and Saint Francis, of dragons slain and miracles performed. Though she did not always understand the words, she understood the love behind them. And when someone was sad, she would reach out and hold their hand until the sorrow softened. Outside the bakery, the village continued its quiet life. Children played barefoot in the dirt, chasing chickens and leaping over puddles left by the morning rain. Farmers walked behind wooden plows pulled by oxen, their backs bent beneath the weight of the day's work. At the edge of the forest, hunters returned with rabbits and pheasants slung over their shoulders, their boots caked with mud. And above it all, the church stood tall, its bell ringing out across the fields to mark the hours of prayer. It was more than a place of worship, it was the center of life itself. Every birth, every marriage, every death was marked here, beneath the painted ceilings and flickering candles. The priest, Father Bernard, was an aging man with kind eyes and a voice that carried warmth even in the coldest winter sermons. He spoke often about charity, about welcoming the stranger, about seeing Christ in every face, even those that looked different, even those that spoke differently. One Sunday, after Mass, he noticed Isabel sitting quietly in the back row, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her head bowed as if in deep thought. After the service ended, he approached her and knelt beside her chair. "You have a peaceful heart," he said gently. "That is a gift." Isabel smiled and reached out to touch his sleeve. Then, in her soft voice, she said, "I like your voice." Father Bernard laughed quietly and placed a hand on her head. "Then come listen whenever you can." From that day on, Isabel became a familiar presence in the church. She lit candles, handed out small pieces of bread after communion, and sometimes simply sat in the corner, watching the light pour through the stained glass windows. The other parishioners did not mind. Some even said she brought a sense of calm to the space, as if the very air felt softer when she was near. But not all places were as kind. Farther up the valley, in a village where superstition held more power than faith, there lived a boy named Etienne. His parents loved him deeply, but the neighbors watched him with wary eyes. He did not speak like other children, did not run fast, did not know how to count coins or name the days of the week. Some whispered that he had been cursed at birth, that his silence was a warning from the spirits. His mother tried to shield him from the looks, from the hushed conversations behind closed doors. She dressed him in clean clothes, taught him to greet people with a smile, and took him to church every Sunday, hoping that the prayers would keep him safe. But fear has a way of growing in dark corners. One evening, a traveling healer visited the village, claiming to cure ailments both seen and unseen. When he saw Etienne, he asked many questions, then muttered something about imbalance in the body, about spirits that needed to be cleansed. The boy's parents listened, unsure whether to believe him, but frightened enough to consider his words. That night, they burned herbs in their home, sprinkled holy water around the door, and whispered prayers into the darkness, hoping to protect their son from forces they could not see. Etienne never understood why they suddenly looked at him with worry in their eyes. He only knew that his favorite songs were sung more often, that his mother held him a little longer before sleep, and that his father now sat beside him at night, telling him stories of brave knights and gentle saints. Despite the fears of some, most communities in medieval Europe found ways to accept those who were different, not always perfectly, not always openly, but with enough kindness to allow lives like Isabel's, Matthew's, and even Etienne's to continue. In some villages, people like them were given small roles in daily life, helping in gardens, tending animals, or serving as companions to the elderly. In others, they were taken in by religious orders, living quietly among monks and nuns who saw no need to judge what God had already accepted. There were no hospitals as we know them today, no doctors who could explain the reasons behind their differences. But there was still care, still shelter, still love. And in a world where life was often short and hard, that was no small thing. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low behind the hills and the sky turned to gold, Matthew would walk with Brother Thomas to the edge of the monastery grounds. From there, they could see the village below, the smoke rising from chimneys, the fields stretching wide beneath the evening light. Matthew pointed once and said, "People are like stars. Each one shines in their own way." Brother Thomas smiled and nodded. "Yes, my friend. That is true. And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this story might feel the same quiet peace settle inside them, the kind that comes not from loud proclamations or grand gestures, but from the gentle certainty that everyone belongs, even if the world does not always say it aloud." So, as our journey through this age of faith continues, we leave behind the candlelit chapels, the warm kitchens, and the quiet monasteries. We carry with us the memories of Matthew, Isabel, and Etienne, three souls who lived not in history books, but in the hearts of those who loved them. Now, the wind begins to change. The world moves forward again, and soon we will step into a new era, one where science begins to rise, where ideas shift, and where the quiet ones must find new places to belong. But for now, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a slow-moving stream. Let your breath soften. Let your mind rest in the hush of this medieval evening. Because our story is not over yet. Part 3, The Age of Enlightenment and Institutionalization. The world was changing. By the early 1800s, the soft glow of candlelight had begun to give way to the flicker of gas lamps. The quiet hum of village life was being replaced by the steady rhythm of machines, the hiss of steam engines, and the clatter of carriages rolling over cobblestone streets. Cities were growing, and with them came new ideas about medicine, about the mind, and about what it meant to be different. In London, a boy named Thomas lived with his family in a narrow brick house near the docks. His parents worked hard, his father as a dock worker, his mother mending clothes for neighbors who could barely afford to pay. They were not wealthy, but they loved their children deeply, and Thomas, though slower than the other boys his age, brought a quiet joy into their home. He loved to watch the ships come in from faraway places. He would sit on the steps outside their door for hours, tracing shapes in the dust with his finger, humming softly to himself while listening to the shouts of sailors unloading crates of tea, spices, and cotton. His sister, Margaret, often sat beside him, telling him stories about dragons and queens, even though he did not always understand all the words. But not everyone saw Thomas the same way. Some neighbors whispered that he was simple-minded, or that he had been born under an unlucky star. Others thought he should be taught to work in a factory or sent away to learn discipline. There were rumors of new places opening in the city, places where people like Thomas could live together, be studied, and perhaps even be improved. Thomas's parents had never heard of such places before, but one Sunday after church, a man approached them. He wore a long coat and carried a leather notebook. He introduced himself as Dr. Whitmore, a physician interested in understanding the minds of children who learned differently. "You must understand," he said gently, "we are making great progress in science. We can help your son, if you allow us to take him in." Thomas's mother looked at her child, sitting quietly nearby, unaware of the conversation shaping his future. She wanted to believe that this man could help. She wanted to believe that Thomas would be safe, that he would be cared for, that someone might finally understand why he spoke so slowly, why he sometimes forgot names, why he needed extra time to tie his shoes. So, after many sleepless nights and whispered prayers, they made the decision. One morning, just as the sun was rising over the rooftops, Thomas was dressed in his best clothes, a clean shirt, a pair of patched trousers, and boots that still fit, though they were beginning to pinch at the toes. His mother packed a small cloth bag with bread, cheese, and a wooden toy horse carved by his father. Then she knelt before him and said, "You're going to stay somewhere new for a little while. But we will visit soon." Thomas smiled and nodded, though he didn't fully understand what was happening. They walked through the crowded streets of London, past shops selling buttons and books, past beggars wrapped in rags, past the scent of roasted chestnuts and the distant sound of a violin playing somewhere unseen. At last, they reached a tall stone building with iron gates and windows that seemed too high to reach. It was called St. Clement's Home for Special Children. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soap and something else, something harder to name, something like waiting. There were other children there, some older, some younger, each moving through the halls with a quietness that felt almost rehearsed. Some spoke clearly, others only murmured. Some ran when they were allowed, others simply watched. Thomas was given a small room with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a window that looked out onto a courtyard where birds landed on the grass. It was peaceful, in its own way. But it was also unfamiliar. The days followed a strict schedule. Wake up at 6. Wash hands. Eat porridge. Attend lessons. Walk in the garden. Pray. Sleep. Dr. Whitmore visited often, asking Thomas questions in a calm voice. "Can you tell me how old you are?" 9. "What is your full name?" "Thomas James Harper." "Very good. Now, can you count to 10? Thomas tried. He got to 7 before his voice trailed off. He looked at the doctor, unsure if he had done well or poorly. Dr. Whitmore made notes in his book and said, "We will practice more tomorrow." Thomas did not know what the notes meant, but he liked the doctor's voice. It was kind, even if it asked difficult questions. Life in the home was not cruel, but it was not warm either. The staff was polite, but rarely affectionate. Meals were regular, but never exciting. Lessons were held every day, but no one ever seemed to graduate. It was as if time moved differently here, slower, quieter, like water dripping from a leaky faucet. Sometimes, Thomas missed his family terribly. He missed the smell of his mother's cooking, the sound of his sister's laughter, the way his father would lift him onto his shoulders during festivals. When letters arrived from home, he held them carefully, running his fingers over the paper as if trying to feel the love inside. He could not read them very well, so a nurse would sit with him and read aloud. And when she finished, Thomas would smile and say, "They miss me." "Yes," she would reply. "They do." Outside the walls of St. Clement's, the world continued to change. Scientists debated new theories about the brain. Doctors published papers about conditions they were only beginning to understand. Some believed that with enough training, people like Thomas could become useful members of society. Others argued that they were better kept apart, studied in controlled environments. Thomas knew nothing of these debates. He only knew the rhythm of his days, the soft clang of the breakfast bell, the cool touch of the floor beneath his bare feet in the morning, the way the sunlight slanted across the hallway at midday. And then, one afternoon, something changed. A new boy arrived. His name was William, and unlike Thomas, he did not seem afraid. He walked into the home with his head held high, his eyes full of curiosity. He asked questions constantly. Where were the books? Who decided when meals were served? Did anyone ever get to go outside beyond the courtyard? Thomas watched him closely, fascinated by his energy. One evening, after lights out, he whispered from his bed, "Do you miss your family?" William rolled onto his side and replied, "Every day. But I think this place isn't forever." Thomas didn't know what that meant. He had never considered that he might leave. He had never imagined another life beyond these walls. But something in William's voice gave him hope. And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this story might feel a little warmer, a little calmer, and maybe, just maybe, drift off to sleep beneath the same stars that once watched over Thomas as he dreamed of home. The seasons passed slowly at St. Clement's home for special children, like pages turning in an old book that no one seemed in a hurry to finish. Winter came first, bringing frost that painted the windows with delicate patterns and made the courtyard grass sparkle under the pale sun. Then spring returned, softening the earth and filling the air with the scent of damp soil and blooming daffodils. Thomas had been at the home for nearly 2 years now, and though he still missed his family deeply, the sharp ache of longing had softened into something quieter, more familiar, like the hum of a distant lullaby. He had learned the routines well. He knew when the morning bell would ring, when the nurse would come to check if everyone was awake, when the bread would be warmest and the milk just the right temperature. He knew which chair by the window let in the most sunlight, and which corner of the garden smelled most like lavender after it rained. But more than anything, he had grown close to William. William had arrived not long after Thomas, full of questions and restless energy, and over time, he had become a kind of anchor in this strange world. Though they were different, William spoke quickly and thought even faster, while Thomas moved through life with a calmness that sometimes felt like wisdom. They understood each other in ways that didn't always require words. Sometimes they played quiet games together, tracing letters in the dust or trying to guess what shape the clouds might take next. Sometimes they simply sat side by side beneath the old oak tree in the courtyard, listening to the birds and watching the wind move the leaves. One afternoon, as they sat together, William asked, "Do you think we'll ever leave this place?" Thomas looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Maybe." William nodded, as if that was enough. Life inside the home was beginning to change, slowly but surely. The staff, once strict and distant, had started to soften. A few of the nurses began calling the boys by their names instead of numbers. One of them, Nurse Evelyn, often stayed after lessons to read stories aloud, her voice rising and falling like music. She would sit in the common room with a book on her lap, and the children would gather around her like moths drawn to flame. She read tales of faraway lands, of brave knights and gentle queens, of dragons who could fly but chose not to because they loved the ground too much. And though some of the children did not understand all the words, they understood the feeling behind them, the warmth, the wonder, the promise that there was more to life than these walls. Dr. Whitmore still visited often, but he was no longer the only doctor involved. A new physician had arrived, a woman named Dr. Langford, who wore glasses and carried herself with quiet confidence. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, she asked different kinds of questions. Instead of asking Thomas to count or name the days of the week, she would ask, "What makes you happiest?" Or, "What do you enjoy doing most?" Thomas answered simply, "Being outside." And then, after a pause, listening to stories. Dr. Langford smiled and wrote something in her notebook. Over time, small changes became noticeable. There were more books in the reading room. Some of the older boys were allowed to help in the kitchen or tend the garden. On nice days, the children spent longer hours outside, walking along the gravel paths or sitting beneath the shade of the trees. There were still rules, still structure, still moments when the silence felt too heavy. But there was also laughter now, real laughter, and the sound of children running across the courtyard when they were allowed. Thomas noticed how William changed, too. He no longer asked as many questions about leaving. Instead, he started helping others, showing younger boys how to tie their shoes, teaching them songs he had learned from his mother before coming here. He told jokes, made faces, and once even convinced the cook to give them extra slices of apple pie on Sunday. The staff began to notice, and slowly, the idea took root that perhaps people like Thomas and William were not broken things in need of fixing, but simply people, each with their own way of seeing the world, their own pace, their own quiet strengths. Outside the walls of St. Clement's, the world continued to shift. In London and beyond, new voices were rising, doctors, teachers, and activists who believed that people with differences should not be hidden away, but welcomed into the fabric of society. They argued that institutions should not only house people, but teach them, support them, and eventually, prepare them for life beyond those walls. It was a slow movement, like the turning of a great wheel, but it was happening. Back at the home, Thomas received another letter from his family. This time, Margaret had written it herself, her handwriting uneven but full of love. She told him about the new puppy they had adopted, about the festival in town, about how much they missed him. At the bottom of the page, his father had added a simple line. "We are proud of you." Thomas folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket, where he kept it for days afterward, touching it occasionally as if to remind himself that he was remembered, that he belonged somewhere. One evening, as the sky turned pink and the bells rang softly in the distance, Thomas and William sat together beneath the oak tree again. "I used to think this place was forever," William said quietly. Thomas looked at him, then smiled. "Maybe it isn't." William leaned back against the trunk and closed his eyes. "Maybe it's just part of the story." Thomas nodded. That made sense to him. Because even in places like St. Clement's, where life moved at its own pace and the days blended together like colors in water, something was changing. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first signs of spring after a long winter. But it was there. And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this story might feel the same quiet peace settle inside them, the kind that comes not from loud proclamations or grand gestures, but from the gentle certainty that even in the most structured corners of the world, kindness can grow. So, as our journey through this age of science and shifting beliefs continues, we leave behind the stone walls of St. Clement's, the whispering corridors, and the courtyard filled with birdsong. We carry with us the memories of Thomas and William, two boys who lived not in history books, but in the quiet spaces between them. Now, the wind begins to change again. The world moves forward once more, and soon we will step into a new era, one where ideas continue to evolve, where laws begin to protect, and where the quiet ones start to find their place in the wider world. But for now, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a slow-moving stream. Let your breath soften. Let your mind rest in the hush of this mid-century evening. Because our story is not over yet. Part 4, The Modern Era. The world had changed again. By the late 1970s, the soft glow of gas lamps had long been replaced by electric light. Trains now carried people across entire continents in a single day. Televisions flickered in living rooms across the world, bringing stories from faraway places into homes filled with laughter, music, and the quiet hum of everyday life. In a small town in the Midwest, a boy named Daniel was born into a family that loved him deeply. His parents had not known much about Down syndrome before he came into their lives, but they learned quickly, through books, through doctors, and most of all, through watching him grow. Daniel's eyes were wide and kind, his smile easy and warm. He loved cartoons, especially ones with talking animals and silly songs. He loved jumping on the trampoline in the backyard, where he would bounce for hours while his younger sister cheered him on. And he loved going to the grocery store with his mother, where he would help carry the bags and greet every cashier like an old friend. His parents made a promise to themselves from the very beginning: Daniel would never be hidden away. He would go to school with other children. He would learn how to read, how to count, how to tie his shoes. He would be included, not because it was trendy or politically correct, but because it was right. And so, when Daniel turned 5, he started kindergarten, not in a special classroom, not behind closed doors, but in the same room as everyone else. It wasn't always easy. Some parents were unsure at first. Some teachers weren't trained for it. But Daniel was patient. He smiled often. He listened carefully. And slowly, quietly, he became just another part of the class. He didn't always speak clearly, but he tried. He didn't always finish his work as fast as the others, but he never gave up. And when he did something well, a spelling test, a coloring page, a dance during the school play, the whole class clapped for him, not out of pity, but out of pride. At home, his family celebrated every step forward. His father taught him how to ride a bike, holding onto the back until Daniel found his balance. His mother helped him write letters to his grandparents, guiding his hand gently over the paper. And his sister, ever his biggest fan, taught him how to whistle, even though it took him weeks to get the sound right. As the years passed, the world around them was changing too. Laws were being written that said children like Daniel had the right to learn alongside their peers. Schools were beginning to understand that inclusion wasn't just about letting someone sit in a classroom, it was about making sure they belonged. Teachers were learning new ways to teach, and students were learning new ways to see. There were still challenges, of course. Sometimes Daniel got frustrated when things didn't come easily. Sometimes people stared when he talked loudly in public. Sometimes he felt tired of explaining himself, of showing that he could do things, just in his own way. But he was never alone. He had friends, real ones, who invited him to birthday parties, played soccer with him at recess, and sat beside him at lunch. He had a teacher who believed in him, who stayed after school to help him practice reading. And he had a family who reminded him, every single day, that he mattered. When Daniel finished high school, it wasn't with a grand speech or a scholarship. It was with a quiet joy, a simple ceremony under strings of white lights, and a hug from his mother that lasted just a little longer than usual. After that, he began working at a local bookstore. It wasn't a big job, but it was his. He shelved books, helped customers find what they were looking for, and sometimes read aloud to children during story hour. He wore a name tag that said, "Hi, I'm Daniel," and he smiled whenever someone asked him a question. His coworkers liked him. They teased him gently when he forgot where he put his coffee mug, and they laughed when he sang along to the radio while dusting the shelves. He wasn't treated differently, not because anyone was trying to be kind, but because he simply fit. Outside the bookstore, the world kept moving forward. Cities grew taller. Music changed. Computers became common in homes and schools. New voices rose in the conversation about disability, not just asking if people like Daniel should be included, but insisting that they must be. People began talking about rights, about dignity, about love without conditions. They talked about jobs, about relationships, about dreams. And slowly, surely, the idea that someone with Down syndrome could live a full, meaningful life stopped being surprising and started being expected. Daniel didn't read all those articles or attend all those conferences. He didn't know the names of the activists or the laws that had been passed. But he knew this. He had a place in the world. He had people who cared for him. And he had a life that was truly his own. One evening, after closing the bookstore, Daniel walked home beneath a sky painted in soft pink and gold. The air was cool, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. As he walked, he thought about everything that had brought him here, the school days, the birthdays, the quiet moments between the big ones. He paused at the corner, waiting for the light to change. A car pulled up beside him, and from inside, a child pointed and waved. Daniel smiled and waved back. Then, softly, almost to himself, he whispered, "I belong." And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this story might feel the same quiet peace settle inside them, the kind that comes not from loud proclamations or grand gestures, but from the gentle certainty that everyone has a place in the world, even if it takes time to find it. So, as our journey through history continues, we leave behind the classrooms, the playgrounds, the bookstores, and busy streets. We carry with us the memories of Daniel, someone who lived not in headlines, but in the quiet spaces between them. Now, the wind begins to change once more. The world moves forward again, and soon we will step into a new chapter, one where inclusion grows deeper, where opportunities expand, and where the quiet ones no longer need to prove they belong. But for now, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a slow-moving stream. Let your breath soften. Let your mind rest in the hush of this modern evening. Because our story is not over yet. The world had changed again, this time, not just in how it looked, but in how it thought. By the early 2000s, the soft glow of television screens filled homes long after dark. Cell phones buzzed with messages that traveled across the world in seconds. Music streamed through headphones, and stories were shared not only in books or newspapers, but on glowing rectangles held in people's hands. In a small city near the coast, a young woman named Lila was beginning to shape her own story, not as someone defined by what she could not do, but by all that she could. She had grown up surrounded by love. Her parents had been there for every step, from the first time she walked, to the day she learned to read, to the moment she stood on stage at her high school graduation and waved shyly at the crowd. She had friends who knew her name, teachers who believed in her, and a sister who sometimes teased her gently but always had her back. Now in her early 20s, Lila lived in a small apartment not far from the ocean. It wasn't big, but it was hers. There were soft blankets on the bed, a small bookshelf filled with picture books and poetry, and a window that looked out onto a quiet street where birds often landed on the telephone wires. Each morning, she woke up slowly, letting the light from the window stretch across the floor before pulling herself out of bed. She made coffee in a bright red kettle, toasted a piece of bread, and sat by the window with her journal, writing a few simple words about how she felt that day. Some days she wrote, "Today I feel happy." Other days, "Today I feel tired but okay." And sometimes, simply, "Today I will try my best." Lila worked part-time at a local cafe called Morning Light, where the scent of roasted beans filled the air and the baristas greeted customers like old friends. She helped fold napkins, stack cups, and sometimes even took orders at the counter. She loved the sound of the espresso machine, the way the steam curled into the air like tiny clouds. Her coworkers liked her. They asked how her day was going, laughed when she told jokes, and sometimes let her pick the music that played over the speakers. She didn't always speak quickly, but she spoke with kindness. And everyone agreed, she brought a warmth to the place that no one could quite explain. Outside of work, Lila volunteered at a community center that helped people with disabilities find jobs, learn new skills, and build friendships. She was part of a small group that met once a week to talk about their lives, share stories, and support each other. They talked about things like dating, dreams, and what it meant to be truly seen. One evening, while sitting in a circle under soft yellow lights, someone asked, "Do you ever feel like people don't see the real you?" Lila thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," she said. "But I know who I am." That helps. There was a pause, then someone else said softly, "That's brave." Lila smiled and nodded. It is. She had known bravery in many forms. She had faced challenges quietly, without fanfare, learning to live independently, managing her money, navigating public transportation. These were things that came easily to some, but not to her. Still, she never gave up. She kept trying, one small step at a time. She also knew love, not just the kind that came from family, but the kind that grew between two people who chose each other. His name was Marcus. He worked at the same community center, helping run programs for young adults with disabilities. He was kind, thoughtful, and had a way of making people feel like they mattered just by listening. They met during a workshop on creative writing. Lila had written a short poem about the sea, and when she read it aloud, Marcus smiled and said, "You have a beautiful way with words." From that day on, they began spending more time together, walking along the beach, sharing stories, watching movies late into the night. Sometimes they didn't say much, just sat side by side, letting silence settle around them like a blanket. When he asked her if she wanted to be his girlfriend, Lila didn't hesitate. She looked him in the eye and said, "Yes. I think I've been waiting for this." Their relationship wasn't perfect, no relationship is, but it was full of laughter, patience, and care. They went on dates to the park, cooked meals together, and sometimes just held hands while walking through town. People noticed them, of course. Some smiled. Others stared. But Lila never let it bother her. Because she knew something most people forgot. Love isn't about being perfect. It's about being seen. And she was. As the years passed, Lila continued to grow, not just in age, but in confidence. She joined a local theater group that performed plays written by and for people with disabilities. She acted in small roles, sometimes narrating the story, sometimes playing characters who taught lessons about kindness and courage. She also started speaking at schools, telling students about her life, not to inspire pity, but to show them that people with Down syndrome are not so different from anyone else. They have hopes. They have fears. They fall in love. They make mistakes. They try again. After one of her talks, a little girl came up to her and said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Lila knelt down and smiled. "You can be anything you want," she said. "Even better than me." The girl hugged her tightly before running back to her class. Back home, Lila wrote about that moment in her journal. "Today I made someone smile. That feels good." Outside her window, the sun dipped behind the hills, casting golden light across the rooftops. The sky turned soft shades of pink and blue, and the wind carried the distant sound of waves rolling onto shore. She sat by the window for a long time, watching the world go by. She thought about Daniel, the boy from the bookstore who had come before her. She thought about Thomas, who had once lived behind stone walls, wondering if he would ever leave. She thought about Kai, who had watched the stars from beneath a pear tree, and Isabel, who had found peace beside a church candle. All of them had lived quietly, gently, beautifully. And now, here she was, part of the same story. Only this time, the story did not end with her being taken away. It did not end with her being hidden. It did not end with her being forgotten. This time, the story ended with her standing tall. With her voice being heard. With her heart being loved. And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this story might feel the same quiet peace settle inside them, the kind that comes not from loud proclamations or grand gestures, but from the gentle certainty that the world can change. And it has. So, as our journey through history draws to a close, we leave behind the classrooms, the cafes, the stages, and the quiet moments between them. We carry with us the memories of those who came before, and the hope of those yet to come. Now, the wind begins to still. The stars appear in the sky. And the hush of night settles gently over everything. Because our story is over. But their stories continue. Part 5, The Future of Inclusion. The world had changed again. It was not sudden or dramatic like the turning of a page in history books, but slow and steady, like the tide reshaping the shore over many years. Cities still buzzed with life, but there was more space for quiet now. More room for kindness. More understanding that everyone moves at their own pace, and that's okay. And this time, a young woman named Amara lived in a small town nestled between rolling hills and wide fields that stretched toward the sky. Her home was modest, 2 stories made of warm-colored stone, with ivy climbing along the sides and a garden filled with lavender and wildflowers. Every morning, she woke up to the soft hum of birds outside her window and the scent of fresh bread baking in the kitchen downstairs. Amara was in her mid-20s, though she often joked that she would never really feel grown up, no matter how old she became. She loved stories, music, and long walks through the woods behind her house, where sunlight filtered gently through the trees and the air smelled like moss and rain. She also had Down syndrome. But to Amara, that was just one part of who she was, like being left-handed, or loving strawberry jam more than any other kind. It didn't define her, but it did shape her path in ways both seen and unseen. She worked at a place called the Nesting Tree, a community center that welcomed people of all abilities. It wasn't just a job, it was a home away from home. Here, artists painted murals on the walls, musicians played soft songs during lunchtime, and everyone helped make decisions about what new programs to start or what events to plan. Amara was part of the Storytelling Circle, a weekly gathering where people shared pieces of their lives through spoken word, poetry, and song. She loved telling stories, not because she thought she was the best at it, but because she believed every voice mattered, even the quiet ones. One evening, while sitting by the fireplace after a long day of work, someone asked her, "Do you ever think about what the future looks like?" Amara thought for a moment before answering. "I see a world where people don't have to prove they belong," she said softly. "Where being different isn't something to fix, but something to celebrate." There was a pause, then someone else whispered, "That sounds beautiful." And maybe it was. But it was also real. Because slowly, surely, that world was already beginning to take shape. In schools, children learned not just math and science, but empathy and respect. They were taught that intelligence came in many forms, and that friendship meant seeing someone for who they truly were, not who others expected them to be. In workplaces, companies began hiring not just for skills, but for heart. They understood that diversity wasn't just about race or gender, but about the way people thought, spoke, and moved through the world. And so, offices opened their doors to people with disabilities, not in token roles, but as leaders, creators, and dreamers. In media, stories changed too. People with Down syndrome were no longer background characters or inspirational quotes. They were leads in movies, hosts on television, poets published in national magazines. Their voices were heard, not because someone wanted to check a box, but because their stories mattered. Amara had grown up watching these changes unfold. She remembered when there were only a few TV shows with actors like her, and now there were whole networks dedicated to inclusive storytelling. She remembered when people stared when she walked into a store, and now they smiled and greeted her by name. Of course, not everything was perfect. There were still days when things felt hard. When she got frustrated because something didn't come easily. When she missed people who had moved away. When she wondered if she was enough. But she had learned something important over the years. Being enough didn't mean being fast, or smart, or loud. It meant being present. It meant showing up, even when it was hard. It meant choosing love, even when the world didn't always choose you back. And so, she kept going. She kept walking through town with her head held high. She kept writing poems in her little notebook. She kept believing in a world that could be kinder, slower, more open-hearted. One afternoon, she sat beneath a tree near the edge of the forest, watching the wind move the leaves above her. A group of children ran past, chasing each other with laughter that echoed like music. One of them paused and looked at her. "Hi," the child said. "Hello," Amara replied. "Are you having fun today?" The child nodded. "Yeah. We're playing tag." "Good," she said with a smile. "Go catch your friends." As the child ran off, Amara watched until they disappeared around the bend, then closed her eyes and leaned back against the tree. She thought about the people who had come before her, the quiet ones who had lived in villages, in monasteries, and institutions. The ones who had been misunderstood, forgotten, hidden away. She thought about Kai, who had once watched the stars beneath a pear tree. About Matthew, who had found peace in a monastery. About Daniel, who had built a life of purpose. They had all been part of the same story. And now, here she was, writing the next chapter. Not alone. Not unnoticed. But surrounded by love. And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this story might feel the same quiet peace settle inside them, the kind that comes not from loud proclamations or grand gestures, but from the gentle certainty that the world is changing. And it has. So, as our journey continues, we leave behind the forests, the community centers, the quiet moments between laughter and tears. We carry with us the memories of those who dreamed of a better world, and the hope that it is already unfolding. Now, the wind begins to change again. The sun dips lower in the sky. And the hush of evening settles gently over everything. The evening settled gently over the hills like a soft blanket pulled over tired shoulders. The sky turned a deep shade of violet, and the first stars began to appear, blinking slowly as if they too were preparing for sleep. In the distance, a breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of lavender and warm earth. Amara sat outside on the steps of her home, a cup of tea resting beside her. She had just finished reading a letter from a friend who lived in another city, someone she had met years ago at a storytelling gathering. The letter was filled with small details about everyday life, what she had cooked for dinner, how the garden was growing, how much she missed their quiet conversations beneath the lights of the community center. Amara smiled as she folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bag. She looked up at the sky again and thought about all the places in the world where people like her were waking up, going to work, meeting friends, falling in love, dreaming dreams that once felt too far away to reach. And she realized something. The world hadn't changed overnight. It had changed slowly, like a river carving its path through stone, not with force, but with time. She remembered when people used to talk about inclusion like it was something special, something to be earned or given as a gift. Now, it simply was. Not because laws had forced it, but because hearts had opened. Children no longer asked why someone spoke differently or walked more slowly. They just accepted it, the way they accepted that some people liked chocolate ice cream and others preferred vanilla. Difference wasn't feared, it was part of the rhythm of life, like the changing seasons or the sound of rain against a window. Schools no longer separated children by ability. Instead, they taught everyone together, believing that learning happened best when minds moved at different speeds, when ideas came from many directions, when kindness was as important as knowledge. Workplaces had stopped measuring worth by how fast someone could type or how many tasks they could complete in an hour. Instead, they valued presence, care, and creativity. And so, people with Down syndrome worked as teachers, artists, scientists, writers, dancers, and dreamers, not because the world wanted to look good, but because these people belonged. Hospitals no longer told parents that their child would never do this or that. Instead, they said, "We're here to support you," and helped families imagine a future full of possibilities. Movies showed characters with Down syndrome not just as symbols of hope, but as real people, with fears, desires, friendships, and flaws. People laughed with them, cried with them, saw themselves in them. And most importantly, people listened. They listened to the voices that had once been ignored. They read the poems written by hands that had taken longer to learn how to hold a pen. They watched the speeches delivered by people who had once been told they couldn't speak clearly enough to be understood. And they realized something simple, yet powerful. Being different doesn't mean being less. It means being human. Amara had grown up watching this change unfold. She had seen it in the way strangers smiled at her now instead of looking away. In the way people asked her opinion, not just about things related to disability, but about music, books, and life. In the way she was allowed to make mistakes and still be respected. She had learned that strength didn't always look like loud speeches or dramatic victories. Sometimes it looked like getting out of bed on a hard day. Like trying again after failing. Like loving yourself even when the world forgets to love you back. One afternoon, while walking through town, she passed a small bookstore she often visited. A new display stood in the window, featuring a book titled The Quiet Lives That Changed the World. She stepped inside, picked it up, and flipped through the pages. There, among the stories of scientists, artists, and activists, was a chapter about people with Down syndrome, not framed as victims or miracles, but as individuals who had quietly shaped history through their resilience, their joy, and their presence. She smiled as she read the final line. They did not ask to be remembered. But they were. She bought the book and carried it home, placing it carefully on her shelf between her favorite poetry collection and a photo album filled with memories. That night, she sat outside again, wrapped in a warm shawl, the stars above her blinking softly like distant lanterns. She thought about Kai beneath his pear tree, Matthew in his monastery, Thomas behind the stone walls, Daniel in his bookstore, Lila with her coffee and journal. Each of them had lived in a different time, under different skies, surrounded by different faces. But they had all shared something quiet and deep. A place in the world. Not given. Not fought for. But simply found. And now, here she was, part of the same story. Only this time, there was no ending in sorrow. No fading into silence. No need to prove herself worthy of belonging. Because now, belonging was simply understood. As the night deepened and the air grew cooler, Amara closed her eyes and let the hush of the evening settle around her. She breathed deeply, feeling the gentle rise and fall of her chest, listening to the soft wind moving through the leaves. And somewhere far away, in another time, another place, someone listening to this story might feel the same quiet peace settle inside them, the kind that comes not from loud proclamations or grand gestures, but from the gentle certainty that the world can change. And it has. So, as our journey through time draws to a close, we leave behind the villages, the monasteries, the institutions, the classrooms, the cafes, the stages, and the quiet moments between them all. We carry with us the memories of those who came before, and the hope of those yet to come. Now, the wind begins to still. The stars shine a little brighter. And the hush of night settles gently over everything. You're still here. Thank you. Maybe your eyes are already closed, maybe your breathing is slowed, maybe you've already drifted into a quiet place between wakefulness and sleep. And if that's true, then thank you for letting this story be the one that carried you there. If you're still listening, though, let me say this, tonight, we walked through time together. We stepped into the warm glow of ancient fires, into the quiet halls of medieval monasteries, into the slow unfolding of new ideas, and finally, into a world where difference is not something to fix, but something to welcome. We met people along the way, Kai beneath his pear tree, Matthew in his monastery, Thomas behind stone walls, Daniel in his bookstore, Lila by her window, Amara beneath the stars. They were not heroes in the way history often remembers them. They did not lead armies or build empires. They did not change the world with loud voices or sweeping actions. But they were part of the world. And that was enough. More than enough. Because every life, no matter how quietly it moves through time, leaves a mark, a touch, a smile, a moment of peace shared with someone else. And now, as our journey comes to an end, let yourself rest in that peace. Let the day slip away behind you. Let your thoughts soften like sand shifting beneath a gentle breeze. Let your body sink just a little deeper into your bed. There's no need to chase anything tonight. No need to remember every word. Just let them drift through you like music played at bedtime, not meant to keep you awake, but meant to help you fall asleep. So if sleep finds you now, go gently. If it waits a little longer, that's okay too. Either way, you are safe. You are seen. You are held in this quiet space we've created together. And somewhere, out beyond the reach of words, someone who lived long ago might be smiling, knowing their story was heard. Good night, my friend. Sleep well.